Dave, in trying to discern reality, which is either an obsession or a compulsion of mine, I'm not sure which, um, the philosophical question of what things really exist is a question that almost is the most fundamental thing you can ask. It's a question that most people will think is ridiculous. But how do you look upon that? As you look upon your world and as you've envisioned it, what things really exist?
What is there in the world? I think this is a really interesting question. I mean, the world does contain some stuff. It does contain some things, but is there an ultimate catalog of all the things that exist? You know, my hand, my shoe, my hair, this room, the number 2, the planet Venus. Could we draw up a list, an inventory of all the things that exist in the world? So I think there's got to be something wrong with that question. The world has a nature. What we're doing in science and philosophy is studying the nature of the world. Maybe it even has a fundamental nature. There's physics, and maybe there's consciousness, and who knows what there is at the fundamental level. And then there's any number of ways of carving this world up into entities. So my own view is there's not one privileged way of carving the world up into things. Into you, into me, into my shoe, into my hand. Any number of different ways of taking all this dough and carving it up. So there is a field of philosophy, ontology, where we say, what's the number of things and what are the things? I think, there's no answer to that question. You can't count them. There's just a way the world is.
Well, but what about categories of things? Are there things we can distinguish from other things? You said numbers.
Yeah.
There's a material world. There are things that are made of particles. And there are 10 to the 80th number of particles, supposedly 10 to the 90th number of photons in the visible universe. And let's take that. And so there are things made of that. That's a category. Is that a separable category?
I think you can introduce all the categories you like. If you want to talk about numbers, you can. If you want to talk about people, you can. You want to talk about sentences, you can. You want to talk about unicorns, or maybe you can't. So maybe there are some rules. But within reason, you can define up all the entities you like. And within a framework, within a given conceptual framework for talking about things, you can say, sure, I acknowledge those things. But now the philosopher, like the mathematician, sure, there are numbers. Now the philosopher steps back and says, but are there really numbers? Do they really exist? Now what are they asking here? And saying, well, sure, the mathematician says there are 4 prime numbers less than 10. So there are numbers. But now the philosopher says, do those numbers really exist? Up in the Platonic third realm, are they entities? Somehow that's the wrong question. You can do mathematics, you can say there are 4 prime numbers less than 10 without needing to bring in this further realm of the entities that exist absolutely and mind independently.
But you can define things that are made of particles. That's a category.
Yeah, I think actually the fundamental level, the place I take these questions most seriously is at the fundamental level in, say, in physics. It defines certain entities and particles that you need for physics. Maybe those things exist fundamentally. Anything above that, I think that's bookkeeping. What is it that, was it Lord Kelvin who said that there's physics and then there's stamp collecting? There's physics, then there's different ways of carving it up. But don't think you're getting at fundamental reality in doing that. No, in my view, maybe there's physics, there's consciousness.
Well, that's important.
And there's stamp collecting.
Because now you've made suddenly 2 big categories.
Yeah.
And so, because you're involved in consciousness and have done some wonderful work there, that's important to you. So therefore you have 2 categories. So maybe somebody else has done something else in prime numbers or abstract objects, and they think their category is the most important, and consciousness they don't particularly care about.
I think we really need to care about the fundamental level of reality, the fundamental natural properties in the world. And I think we need properties of things to have. They have physical properties, they have consciousness properties, and so I'm not sure the entities, though, is the right way to think about it. The world is a giant bunch of stuff. It's a giant flux of process in a big universe. I'm not sure that it actually comes carved into entities. And if it does, they're the entities at the fundamental level, like the particles, maybe some minds.
So what are you saying? You're saying the universe there's only one thing, and it's the universe, and that we in our maybe very limited mental capacity are slicing it in odd ways when it's unsliceable?
I think there's just totally different perspectives on the world. So here's one perspective. There's one universe, and everything else is just slices of it. Here's another perspective. There's a zillion particles in the world, and everything, including the whole universe, is built up from that. What I'm saying is both of those perspectives are equally right and equally wrong. There's no choosing between them.
Which means that there is no sense of reality to it. I mean, you can't, there's nothing fundamental to either perspective.
There's a way things are. There's reality. There's an ultimate way that things are around us. It's the mistake of trying to slice it into entities. That's where I think sometimes
But
philosophy
you've
goes
sliced
wrong.
off consciousness.
I sliced it into properties, different ways, different aspects of the world. You know, there's that people feel a certain way, things have size, things have motion, they have properties. But why think there's a distinguished carving of the world into entities?
And how, if we're distinguishing properties from entities, how would the word substance or stuffs deal with both of those? Where would that fit in?
Well, there's stuff which can be carved into entities, and there's stuff which has properties. You know, stuff is, you know, the stuff of consciousness and the stuff of matter. You know, it's a multi-aspected, multifaceted stuff. But again, why think that there's a thing? There's not a thing which all that stuff constitutes. Well, there's not a set of things into which this stuff gets carved. There's just stuff. That's what the world is.
So is that imposing on reality the constructs of our mind? And I mean, that's a view. That's a view that some people think that the equations of physics are not, you know, representing real reality, but it just are sort of models of observation.
I think that you know, entity talk, we can't help think in terms of entities. It's our way of carving up the world, and we have our own framework for doing this, the framework of ordinary objects. So I think in terms of, you know, hands and heads and chairs and so on, but don't think there's anything privileged about my way of carving up the world into entities. A Martian might carve it up completely differently, seeing patterns in the air as entities. So I don't think either of us is like getting at the privileged way of carving up the world. You can just represent all this stuff in the world in many different ways, all equally good.
Is the question a useful one?
I'm not certain it is. It's interesting to think about for a philosopher. We're interested in science and finding how the world is. But one thing we do find is there's multiple equivalently good descriptions of the world. And I think this question of how to carve the world up into entities may just be one of finding multiple descriptions of the world that are equally good. One thing, 1,000 things, 1,000,000 things, as long as it all describes the world, they're all equally good.
The reason why I have sensed that this question is important, even if you're right, and you may be, is that it may enable us to see things that we haven't seen before, to visualize the sense of reality in a different way than what we're commonly perceived to do.
So, for example?
I don't know. I can't make progress beyond that. But I'm saying that to deal with this kind of question may enable us to see that there's something. If physical reality is one thing, if abstract objects are something else, if consciousness is a third thing, that it's not an abstract object, that it's not part of the material world, maybe that's another thing. Maybe there's a spiritual world where gods live and angels and demons. Yeah, I mean, people think that, so at least I got to address it. So now I can conceptualize 4 or 5 different big categories. Now maybe this whole thing is nonsense.
Multiple aspects of reality. I think it's a good way to think about it. Yeah, there's the physical aspect and the mental aspect, and perhaps the abstract, the mathematical aspect. And then we can ask, how do all these aspects of reality relate to each other? Which is the most fundamental? Which is derivative? And I think that's a fine task for, say, a metaphysician,
right,
organizing the categories of reality to engage in. I mean, Aristotle thought there were 4, right? Was it earth and air and fire and water? And maybe a modern physicalist thinks there's 1. It's all just atoms.
Right.
You know, I think that's a really fascinating question to ask. What are the fundamental aspects of reality? I'm just not sure we need to divide the world into things to do that.